Yeah, let's start. So I'm using GoLand 2020.1.2, which is the latest released version. And for today, I'm gonna teach you some tips and tricks. First trick that I can actually teach you is related to how I organize my projects. And in this case, as you can see, I have a bit of a different setup than the regular one where you can just see the project. And this is categorized using some personal items that I find useful, like demos, work, personal, MISC, and well, projects without any particular category. What you can do is you can right click on a project here and you can say new project group, and this will allow you to create one of projects groups like here. And you can even assign icons to this so you can easily locate a project. That being said, you can use speed search to find your preferred project that you want to work on, and then you can just hit enter to start it. Now, when I'm loading the IDE and I have a project, I will usually see some tabs here, but I personally chose to hide them. The way to do this is if you are using the find action shortcut, and you can say tab placement and then none. As in my case, usually you'd find it at the top of it and you'd be able to see tabs, but I prefer not having any tabs. Another thing that I prefer doing when I code is to allow me to get into a mode where I can focus on code and what I have to do rather than, jump into Windows and being distracted by one thing or another. So to do that, I'm using the Zen mode, which allows me to have a focus on the code itself. So now, normally you'd ask, okay, but there's no more tabs, there's no more tool windows, and especially there's no more project view, right? So how do I do anything without this? How do I jump to files and so on? Well, the answer to that is to use the navigation bar. So the navigation bar, basically, you can invoke it anywhere in the IDE, and it allows you to select everything from your project. So you can navigate up and down, or you can use speed typing to quickly go to a project or to a file. So let's go to the first tip that I want to show you. Throughout the presentation, you will see that I have different colored messages here. So there are some comments which usually describe what we will see, and there are some other colors like this one, which allows us to see examples of what we want to do. I'm going to start with something easy, and this is something that you'll find in your regular day-to-day work. You don't need to particularly import a package in order to get completion for it and add it to the import statement. So for example, if I can say print line here, I will see the print line from the built-in part, but also the FMT package or from log. And I can choose one of these. And I will then be able to continue completing this. So let's use the navigation bar again and jump to another tip from the completion items. This is probably one of the most cool things that you can do in GoLand with completion. And for example, if you type here a function like a HTTP handler, usually you'll get a bunch of completion items options here. But what if you want to narrow down this list? Well, you can use the smart type completion to focus on the types that you strictly need. And this will take into account the packages that you import, such as HTTP package, or allow you to smartly use values for the parameter type that you have. So it's either nil, because it's a function, or a closure function here. Moving forward with our tips, you can use Postfix Completion, which is behaving like a regular completion, by adding the dot after expression. So for example, let's say I can use the var postfix completion here to quickly create a variable. This allows me to have a name already predefined by the IDE and not jump with the cursor after I finish completion with send message. The cool part is that I can use postfix completion after many things. So for example, for error handling, I can use the not nil expression, and I will get the famous if error is not nil. And then I can say something like error panic. I can also use something like error dot return error, and I'm in the main function, so there's nothing to do here, but I can see that we would return the error here if needed. Moving on with our completion tips. Let's say that I have a type here, and that type is accepted by a function as the first parameter. What should I do, and how should I find that function? Because I have no idea how it's named. Well, one way to do it is to type a dot after the element that we have, invoke basic completion once, and then use basic completion once again, so the shortcut that you see here, to search for all the functions that have the first parameter of the type that my item is. In this case, it's going to be a string, so I can use something like toTitle. This is very helpful when you have a custom type, for example, and will narrow down the expression list a lot quicker. Moving on to one of our other options here is the live templates, which behaves like regular completion, but it allows you to quickly type in a expression and use code templating to do so. So in my case, one thing that I use frequently is to connect to the database, and I don't really know the whole connection string off the top of my head. So I can use dbds here, which is a custom postfix live template, sorry, that allows me to have the connection string displayed here. And I can also have parameters to this filled out by default, but I can also change them. So for example, if I were to connect to a different system or that I read from an environment variable, I could use this. I've shown you the live template feature. And one thing that you can also do from 2020.1 is something similar to that, which is a if statement, which compares the value with not nil automatically, and it allows you to basically select this. So it works similar to the postfix completion we've seen earlier. Right, so we've seen the live template for val equals nil earlier, and we don't need to do that. What we can see here is, let's say I want to change this function and add another parameter. If I just type the comma after the int, I get to type more. So I get to type the error. And finally, in this completion tip, I can show you that, for example, if you're familiar with goReturns, you'll see that the IDE automatically suggests values for returns, in this case, the default values. And you are able to change them as well. So for example, I can type here 1, and then I can type something like error, new, and then I can say some error here. So this makes completion easier when using the return statement. Let's go back here and say, what if I have a long identifier and I don't want to type the full name to get the import added and all the name typed out and so on? Like for example, the read write closer. So how do I do that? I just start typing a few parts of it, and the IDE will automatically search for all the matches that it can. And in this case, there's only one IO read write closer, and I can use that. Moving on. We've seen completion working for a bunch of places, right? So what if I want to change the printf statement here into something else, like the print line? Well, I would start typing here, right? And if I press enter, this is going to give me an error because Well, I completed this, but I still have the right part. So how do we achieve this? I would just press tab here instead of enter, and everything to the right of it would be overwritten by the new identifier. And that's how you quickly overwrite identifiers using completion, and you're able to switch between function names, for example, as I did. Moving on to our next completion option, we can see that here we want to assess that a type is of a certain value, concrete value in this case. So how do we do that? Well, we use the type assertion expression, and here we can invoke basic completion. And the IDE will suggest the type that corresponds to our interface. And in this case, my type corresponds to the IO reader interface because it implements the read method. Finally, from our completion section, we will get something that I really like in terms of handler here. And that is the completion for naming of parameters alongside with the actual parameters. So let's say, for example, we have the response writer here, right? So I don't need to type the W because the IDE automatically will infer, hey, this is a HTTP response writer. And commonly it's named W, so let's use that. And similarly, if I do a pointer to request, I get a few other suggestions. So I get the HTTP request, which is named R, but I also get the request from the RPC request because that we don't really know for sure if you want to name R or not. So if I would type again request here, you will see that we also automatically try to give you a different name for the existing parameter, as well as correctly name this one. And that concludes our completion tips. Let's move on with the editing ones. And as you can see, there are quite a few that await us here. First of all will be the cycling expand word completion, which behaves like normal completion, but it's a bit different. How does this work? So let's say I'm typing a string here inside a printf function. And let me bring this a bit here to the center. One way to continue running this one would be, okay, convert and so on and so forth, but that's not really efficient. What I can do is I can say, invoke the cyclic expand word and have convert to string automatically added. And I know for sure that I'm going to find it above. What if I need to select something from below? Well, then I can use the other option for this, and I can say expand backward and cycle through them until I get the one that I need. And as I've said, this one works inside strings as well, so not just regular code. Moving forward, let's go here to the function and say I want to complete it. I will get the parameter information displayed here, which is, okay, I'm expecting this from an IDE, but I'm also be able to invoke the parameter information from here and get the list of fields. Now, as you may know, we already have the fill fields action. So this will allow us to select whatever we want here. And as you can see, as I'm moving along with this, I also get the same highlighting as I would get for function parameters. We can also invoke it on existing code. So for example, here I'm able to see that the subfield one belongs to the substructure field type. So let's say that you want to write a JSON, and this is fairly frequent if you're working with APIs in Go. How would you do that? Well, you would start typing here, and then you'd start typing this, and then you're like, oh, okay, I need to escape this, so it's like this. you'd say, but wait, Florin, you can do better. You can come here, and if you say, for example, select this and turn it into a row string, then you don't need to worry about any escaping and so on. And I would say, yeah, that's true. I don't need to worry about that. But what if, for example, the IDE wouldn't allow me to do this automatically, and I would just have some context here, right? I wouldn't necessarily see that the JSON string is broken. So what can you do? Well, you can use the inject language or reference here, and then you can say, I want to insert a JSON language. And when you do that, automatically the IDE will start doing an inspection for your JSON or for any other language, for that matter. And if I were to invoke alt enter again, you'd be able to say, okay, edit the JSON fragment. Normally, if you see the IDE tabs and so on, you'd have a tab here that would say this is a fragment and you're editing it. But I don't have anything, so this is why I see a split screen. So now I'm able to correctly complete this and solve the problems. Moreover, if I want to actually format this and have it displayed here, the IDE will automatically apply the formatting there as well. And if I would still be back in the good old double quotes here, so let's delete this and say inject language or reference, JSON, and then edit JSON. So if I would say something like status here, let's say 500, the IDE would automatically add the escaping values here as well. So inject language reference can be quite useful. Let's close this and move to our next tip. So we've seen this working for JSON and so on, but let's see how this works for Go templates. In this case, I've already added a Go template type, and let's bring the edit fragment here. So one thing that you do is, well, live demos. Allow me to close this, please. And we were here. Right, so if I go back to editing here, normally you'd be able to see the message here, but it seems that today live demos are not working very great, so let's keep this one to something that actually works. Okay, sorry for that. And what do we have here? So I've prepared a message here, and it's missing the structure and the fields in the structure. So how do we solve this? Well, one thing I would be able to go here and start typing the structure name and so on, but GoLand allows you to invoke the context actions using Alt-Enter, and you're able to automatically create the structure. And if you do this the same for the field, it automatically adds the field for you. And I can quickly jump using the highlight next error to the next error in the file and be able to say, okay, add the field. So you don't need to reach out for the mouse and go grab to like the next error and so on, or scroll down for the file. You can just jump to the next error and add it. So let's say that I want to do a selection here, right? And selection usually involves something like, okay, reaching out for the mouse and be like, okay, I need to, okay, I selected everything that I wanted. How do we do this any better? If I am here with the cursor, I can say expand selection, and this will automatically start to expand the selection around the semantic that I have here. So for example, it will select the field, the function, and then the file. And similarly, I can say shrink the selection, and this will allow me to shrink back the selection again in a semantic way. Moving forward, let's say that I want to add a selection for a value, let's say the field. So how do I select this quickly? I can use the add selection, and then this will automatically add the selection for me, or I can say unselect occurrence, and then it will shift out this. Now, this doesn't mean that you should use this for the rename refactor, and I'll show that a bit later on. Finally, let's say that you have like an item that you want to complete inside of a comment. What you can do is you can invoke the add comment here, that you quickly add a comment that starts with the right string, as you would normally do for GoDoc. And then you say add to field, adds a value to, let's say, demo type. So IDE was just able to invoke the completion as usual, and the IDE was aware of what I'm trying to do and said, okay, there is a single thing that matches demo, and that is demo type, and was able to complete it. So writing documentation should be a lot easier for you now. Moving on with our tips, let's see a few other navigation tips that we have. For example, let's say I want to navigate to a file because I want to do that, and I'm referencing in a comment, or maybe I just need to type it myself. If I have a selection for it and I invoke the go to file here, I will be able to automatically have this selected. And as you can see, it doesn't necessarily work just with the files in my project, but it also works in my dependencies as well, or inside the Go SDK. So I'm able to do this, and I can do my browsing, I can read everything that I need, and so on. But you'd say, okay, so how do we go back? There's no tab, right? One way to do this would be to invoke the switcher, which I did a bit fast because usually that's how you invoke it. And this would allow you to switch back and forth between any file that you want. And in this case, I'm going to switch back here because I want to show you other ways so you can achieve this. For example, you can invoke the recent files. And with this, you'll see a bit bigger pop-up, which allows you to also keep it on screen without having to keep the key pressed. But also you can use speed search to invoke things like the, let's say, database. So if I bring the database here, that works. I just got the panel view. But also I can say, well, I want to go back to the format file. So format is here. What about seeing a nicer view of this? And how do I make sure that, when I want to jump, it's going to jump to the right place? Well, because I was just editing this file, I can use the recent locations and see where my cursor was. And I can see this for all the files here as well. So for example, if I want to say, let's say demo type, and filter all the occurrences of the demo type, I can just do that. And then I can jump, let's say, to that file. Okay, let's go back to our navigation tips and select another one. So let's say that, again, I don't have any other panels here visible and so on, and I want to say, show the structure of something. Let's choose the format package again, because this one is a bit complex. And here I can invoke the file structure quickly and get a pop-up of all the types defined in my current file. And as you can see, there are quite a few of them. But what if I want to see the actual package structure, not just the file itself? So everything that's defined in the package of that file. Well, I can invoke again the same shortcut, and this will bring up all the identifiers that are defined and allow me to jump anywhere in the package. Also, it will remember your selection. So when you go next time and say show package structure, it will automatically show you the package structure. Let's go back to our tip here. Let's say that I also really want to select this in the project view. How do I do that? Well, I can bring the project view and then I can start typing. I think I'm in the navigation. I'm not really sure which one of the tips, so maybe it's this one, maybe it's that one. the better way to do this would be to say navigate, select in, and this allows you to say project view or remote host if you're connected to one using the SFTP plugin, or you can say file structure or show in Explorer, and in this case it will actually open the Windows Explorer because I'm running on Windows, or a file or a web browser in case you connect this to a web browser. But using the project view, I was able to open it quickly in the project view. Now I can hide it again because we don't need it. We've learned how to use the navigation bar. On our final tip here that I want to show is how you can navigate around types and methods using the built-in type hierarchy and call hierarchy. So for example, let's say I'm on the reader type and I want to show all the types that it inherits from or uses the reader type. And in this case, it's an interface. So I'll see all the types that implement reader interface. And as you can see, this is pretty much instant, and it allows me to show all the types, my type as well, and other types from the standard library. So how do I know that, this is the type I'm looking for right now? Well, I can use the find action and say quick definition. And it has its own shortcut, but if you're like me and you're like, okay, I don't remember how to invoke that, you can just browse for the action itself, and then you'll be able to see the shortcut here next to it. And the quick definition works in other places as well, which I'm going to show you shortly. Okay, enough of this. Let's say that I want to see the methods being used somewhere. So how do I use that? Well, you can bring up the call hierarchy. And in this case, there are quite a few places where the IO reader read method is used, but I can see all of them. So for example, I can see that this is implemented in HTTP2 pipe or in some closure function here. I can scroll down a bit and probably see my function as well, although this is quite a bit below. But I can also see other types as well. And then I can drill down and see all the project places where this is called. This concludes our navigation tips. And now let's move on to some refactoring. So you're a Go programmer, right? And you've heard of interfaces, you use them, and that's all good. But let's say you want to implement one. The way you'd implement one would be have Go docs open somewhere or the IDE with some documentation and try to reach out all the methods and so on. There is a better way to do this. What you can do is you can invoke the generate interface here, and you can say, okay, I want to implement methods. Now, because there is no type that I have in this file, I will select create type, but otherwise I would just select the type that I want the interface to implement. And now I'm being asked, what interface are you likely to implement now? Like what interface would you like to do? Let's go back to our read write closer interface because I like that one in particular today. And this is how I implement an interface on a new type or existing type. And let's say my read write closer interface. Right, and I can change the parameter names and so on if needed. And you'll say, but Florin, you have a typo, and then it doesn't really look good. So how do you fix this? Well, remember that rename refactoring that I promised to show? Let's invoke this using the quick shortcut, or you can invoke the refactor this, which allows you to bring up all the refactorings. And in this case, let's select the rename in refactoring. What I'm going to show you here is basically how I rename everything to be as I want it to be in the first place. Okay, moving on to our next refactoring. let's say that I want to change the signature of a function, and I probably want to add, I don't know, let's say an error. How do I do that? Well, the classic way would be to click somewhere here, type error here, and then observe all the places where I have errors and so on and so forth. But can we do better? Well, what we can do is we can invoke the change signature, and then we can say out of this, let's add a return value here. We don't give it a name because the other value is not named, but we can edit this one to give it a name as well. Right, so what will happen here now is, let's say error here, and I get completion as well, right? And can I have a default value? Well, let's say no for this one in particular, but I can give it something like errors, and the IDE would actually do that. So actually, let's go with this. So what will happen here is all the places where I'm calling this function now add one more return value, as well as the function itself where I have return statements. Now we'll return errors, new, and then a new error. And that would be quite useful. Let's say I want to undo this. Well, it's simple as hitting the undo button. But if I want to switch the parameters around, I can also just go here and say, okay, switch between these two and refactor, and that's it. The parameter order has changed. You can do the same with adding parameters, removing them, and so on and so forth. Our second to last tip about refactorings revolves around the extract interface. And as I said earlier, like if you're a Go developer, you're probably using interfaces, but usually after you reach a certain number of types that implement your interface, you probably say, hey, I have enough types that are common using these methods. Let's abstract them through an interface. So what you can say is extract interface, and then you'll be able to give it a name. Let's say demoer, because I like a better name here right now. Choose which methods are part of your interface, where the interface should be placed on disk. So in this case, I want to keep it in the same package. I want to keep it in the same file even, and rename. And now my interface is implemented. How do I know that? Well, I have these indicators here, which allow me to navigate back and forth the structures that implement it. Moving on to the last tip, let's say that we want to take the strings here and make a single value out of them. What we can do is we can invoke the refactor this method here, and we can say, well, I want to extract either a variable or a constant, let's say constant. And the IDE will ask you, hey, I've seen there are two occurrences of this. Do you want to replace both of them or just a single one? Let's go with both of them and say my message here. But if I change my mind and let's say I've made other editing since then, I can simply hit undo. So what do? Well, I can say refactor this on the constant and say inline. And I'm going to be back in this one. Okay, this was the last tip. We have a few more, and after that, we'll get to the question and answers, and looking forward to see some of your questions. Running, debugging, and testing, these are probably the things that will take most of our time, right? And let's say, well, I want to do a breakpoint here. I can do that, I can do that quite simple, right? But I also don't want to interrupt execution every time for all the values. I just want to know when error is not nil. Normally, you'd say, well, you can place a breakpoint a line below, right? Because you can just break in here. But maybe there's something that prevents me to do that, or I want to observe some other conditions. So how do I do that? I can invoke the edit breakpoint and say, just break when error is not nil. And as you can see, we get completion here as well, but we also get to have a condition for the breakpoint. So when I go here and I say debug, let's wait for the Gopher to compile our application because we need to compile with the debugging settings turned on so that we can get the best out of it. We see that we've stopped the execution, and we stopped the execution only for the error value of oh my, because, well, that's what our code says here, right? It says if n is 23, then return an error called oh my. Moving forward with our debugging tips and running and so on, let's say that we, I don't know, write tests, right? Like we have to write tests at some point. How do I do that? Well, one way would be to use the generate function. And then I would say, I don't want to implement interfaces. I don't want to write an empty test file because that's not useful. I want to have a test for a function. And the IDE will generate that for me automatically, right? Okay, so let's say we want to write a test case here. And let's do that quickly. How do I do something useful here? Well, let's give it a name. Let's give it some fields. I would say field 1 is of value, let's say 1. And then what else? I want arguments. I want the value to be 1. And then here I think, I don't know, let's say 0, because that's it. And I would say add comma here because that's what's missing, right? So how would I do this? Well, I would run this using coverage, right? Because I also want to get coverage for my tests and so on. And I would see that, you know, I have quite a good coverage in terms of like files that I'm covering, right? And if I navigate to main Go, I would see that, yeah, the function is covered 100%. So that's cool. Here, this one main function is not covered, so we need to figure out a way to test that or have the least content we can. But we also failed. So how do I do that and not have to press the run button again? Well, I can say toggle auto test here. And then under settings, I can say the auto test should be delayed for 1 second, meaning that after 1 second, everything will be saved and tests will run again. So let's change this one to 2. Wait a second and let the Gopher run the tests again. And now everything reloaded, including the coverage report, and I know that the test is running okay. And by default, I'm not showing the past tests because I want to localize just the ones that are not working. So this is pretty useful if you're used to the TDD method of doing things, but also if you want to do quick edits and have the tests run automatically for you. Let's close this a bit, and let's close the coverage as well. Okay, well, let's move on, and let's see the tip here. So we said something about debugger so far, like we use debugger, right? But what happens if we have a more complex application here? And let me first bring up the dependencies into my project. So let's say, well, I have a web server and it has all these handlers and so on. How do I know that whenever I hit a breakpoint, I see something useful? Well, normally, if I just debug here, the Gopher will compile, and then when I have a look at the stack traces and so on, I don't really see anything that is that useful. That's because, well, we don't really know where the debugger stops, right? So when the debugger stops here, I can see a bunch of Go runtime park and so on, and it's not easy to understand, okay, where am I? The only thing that I know for sure is that it stops in the function that gives me an the error itself or the breakpoint or anything like that, right? So how can we make this listing a bit more useful? Well, let's close this, right? And as we've seen here, there is a way to add something. There is an article, and we'll share this in the blog post that follows this recording. But if you want, you can take a screenshot of this link here. And in that article, we describe a way for you to instrument your code and basically add one method using runtime pprof or a third-party package for you to actually compile the binary and then run the debugger with that setting so that you can get labels for Go routines. And you'll ask, okay, what are these labels for Go routines? Labels for Go routines allow you to annotate Go routines. And if you remember our previous view where we had only runtime park and so on, now we get a bit more useful information for the code that we control. So for example, here I can see that this Go routine stopped in the basket. This Go routine stopped in the page for the product ID. And this Go routine actually stopped at a certain product. So this allows me to understand where the application is at and what other Go routines are running at the same time as my code is running. Once again, I will leave this one more second on the screen, but as I said, will share this link with you afterward, and you can find it on our blog. Let's move on to the last two tips that we have for run and debug. And here you'll say, oh, okay, let's go to the main test file. Okay, let's go to the test file. I'm not going to show you all the benchmark types that we have, but just know that we have both CPU, memory, but also blocking and mutex profilers. So let's say if I run this using the CPU profiler, and this works both for benchmark functions as well as test functions, then you'll be able to see flame graphs in your IDE without having to install anything or anything like that. And you can start filtering them or hover them to get more useful information. You can also zoom in to see what happens. But if you're like me and you're like, okay, I don't understand flame graphs and I don't want to learn them, you can jump to the call tree and then you'll be able to see the methods that were taking the most time. Or you can jump to the method list and have direct rendering of that, as well as all the callback traces and so on. Similarly, this can happen for the memory profiler, the blocking profiler, and so on. Finally, our last tip that I want to show you today is the opportunity for you to debug your code faster. Let's say you've set a breakpoint here and you're like, okay, I'm going to run this with the debugger, and now I have to jump in make demo so that I can then finally execute grid. But there's a better way. If you use the smart step into, you are able to select which function call you want to jump into from a certain chain of function calls. And in this case, I want to avoid make demo, and I want to jump into the grid function. So let's jump into that. Now, as you can see, we avoided jumping into make demo, but also jump directly here. You can also see that there is a my type is initialized value for the demo here, and you're able to get that value from here. So how did that happen? Well, if I go to the definition of demo, then the type itself has a method on it called DebugString, which returns the string, and it's very easy for the IDE to evaluate. We have a blog post describing how you can do this, and just know that this is built using the in IDE support, so it's not relying on Delph to evaluate functions, meaning that if the expression is too complex, it's not going to be able to display the same value as it does in my case. To better understand how this would work, let's rename this for a second to something like debugger queue and so on, and let's rerun this. Now I see that when I'm here and I would say jump into grid, I would see the less useful information called main demo because that's the type, but I wouldn't necessarily have more information about the type itself. And with that part, this concludes our list of tips and tricks that I had for today. One thing that I would like to share with you before we switch to the question and answer is that we recently started our early access program. And this program allows you to test our upcoming IDE release, which is the 2020.2. And that means that you get to see all the new features earlier, such as new inspections, project templates, comments, and widgets, and so on and so forth. This also means that because it's an early release, we may have some issues. So don't rely on this 100%, although we'll try to validate it as much as possible. Some bugs may happen. But in case you want to give us feedback on new features that we'll release in a couple of months, or you want to be on the edge, this is a perfect time for you to do so. You'll find more information under our blog, and you'll see that we'll publish more information as soon as we release new versions.